The house on 13th Street. Someone still lives there. I've hesitated for a long time about sharing this story, but after everything that happened, I can't sleep at night anymore, and maybe someone here can help me understand what this was. If you read it to the end, I'll be grateful, even if you just tell me I'm not crazy. This happened a few years ago. I had just moved to a small town in South Carolina, where most of the houses were old and had history. Not many people in our area were keen on living in new constructions. I was looking for peace, and old buildings had always attracted me. One day, I saw a listing on Craigslist for a house being sold at an unbelievably low price. The seller didn't give many details, only that the house was on 13th Street, and if I was interested, I could come see it for myself. Since the price was really good and the area seemed quiet, I decided to go take a look. The house was located in the old part of town, far from the main roads. It sat on a low hill, surrounded by woods on all sides. The facade was dark, with moss-covered walls, and the windows were almost entirely clouded with dust. But something about it caught my attention, though I couldn't exactly say what. Maybe it was the feeling you get when you realize you're in a place where not everything is as it seems. The seller was an old man who looked like he belonged to the house itself, dark, almost blending into the surrounding forest. He wore old-fashioned clothes, and his face was stern, with an ancient key in his hand, the kind that might fit doors from the 1800s. "Would you like to take a look?" he asked, and I nodded. He unlocked the door, and immediately I was hit by the smell of dampness and old wood. It felt like the house hadn't known fresh air in years. First impressions. The house was huge, though not very tall. From the entrance hall, there was a steep staircase leading to the second floor, and on either side were rooms, one of which was clearly being used as a living room. The windows were nailed shut with wooden planks, and while this could have been part of a renovation, there was a strong sense that someone had been trying to hide something. I followed the seller as he silently pointed out rooms while I carefully examined everything around me. One room struck me as particularly unusual. It was completely empty, but there was an old rug on the floor that didn't seem to belong to the house. On the walls, at first glance, there didn't seem to be anything odd, but I noticed that in one room, the paint had started to peel off, revealing strange marks underneath. "What is this?" I couldn't help asking. The seller looked at me, and his face betrayed no emotion. "Don't mind that. This house has a history," he replied, almost warning me. Oddly enough, his words didn't seem that strange to me at the time. Maybe it was just an old house with years of wear. I looked at his hands. They were scarred, which also seemed a bit unusual for a man of his age. The night in the house. I wanted to stay the night. I agreed to the condition, though the seller seemed surprised. "Why not leave?" "This is no place for sleeping," he said, but I was already set on it. The seller seemed a bit off, like he was trying to run from something, and that intrigued me. I stayed in the house. The seller left, locking the door behind him. The same key he had given me worked perfectly. All the windows were shut, and I felt safe. From time to time, I heard rustling outside, but it seemed normal in such a wooded area. At first, the night was quiet, but I began hearing faint sounds. It was as if someone was walking down the hallway, though I was alone. Strange events. When I decided to lie down and sleep, I started noticing that the floor beneath my bed was growing cold. It wasn't the usual cold, but something deeper, something like decay. I sat up and looked at the floor, and then I noticed a faint greenish glow coming from between the wooden floorboards. I couldn't stay in bed any longer. A strange fear overtook me, and I decided to investigate the place. Walking through the house, I stumbled upon a room on the second floor that was locked. The key I had fit perfectly, and I felt my heart racing as I opened the door. Inside was a large, old wardrobe. Its doors were slightly ajar. As I opened them, I found a stack of photographs. These were old black and white shots of people, almost all of them with the same expressions, closed off, exhausted. However, one of them caught me off guard. In this photo, there was a man who looked like the seller. But what really shocked me was the fact that on the back of the man in the picture, there was an inscription, written in faded red letters, "Don't leave and don't ask." That was the last thing I saw before all the lights in the house went out. In the darkness, I immediately ran down the stairs, but with every step I took, I felt like someone was following me. Part 2. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear my footsteps as I ran down the stairs. The windows, which were boarded up, gave the house an odd sense of confinement, and that feeling only grew stronger the closer I got to the door. I quickly tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked, it just wouldn't open for some reason. My hand kept pushing on the door handle, but it wouldn't move. That's when I heard something I hadn't expected, a faint whisper. It was so soft that it could have been the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But I was sure. It was a human voice, and it sounded as though it was asking something from me. "Don't go," I heard the whisper, which almost immediately turned into a low, indistinct mumbling. I tried again to twist the door handle, this time much harder, but the door didn't budge. A feeling of helplessness overtook me. Each time I tried to escape, the voice grew louder, clearer, and the sense that someone was watching me intensified. Panic nearly paralyzed me. Everything around me seemed unnervingly silent. Even the air was hard to breathe. The footsteps I had been hearing behind me and the whispering that permeated the walls seemed endless. I turned around and realized the light in the rooms had started to dim, even though I was far from any source of darkness. My hand again reached for the door handle when suddenly, in a room to my right, a light flickered on. I felt it before I saw it. I panicked. Something was wrong. There was no reason for this to happen. I rushed to the door, and surprisingly, it opened. As soon as I ran outside, I looked back and saw nothing. Just the dark silhouette of the house, staring back at me. I had no idea what had just happened or why I couldn't get out earlier, but I felt that what had occurred inside that house was not a coincidence. Something had been waiting for me there, in the dark. Even now, when I'm far from it, I feel that fear, deep inside me. Part 3. The next day, I decided to learn more about the house. The town I lived in was small, and almost everyone knew each other, so I went to a few local residents. The first person I asked was an older woman who worked at a shop nearby. "Have you heard about the house on 13th Street?" I asked. She looked at me with a strange expression on her face and replied, "That house? Listen, young man, it's better that you don't get involved. Nothing has happened there for a long time. But when I was little, people said you shouldn't even go near it. And even when I grew up, I heard stories about strange noises there at night. Screams. But all that's been forgotten. You want to know more?" I was startled and a little unsettled, but she continued. "This house belonged to a family that disappeared many years ago, after their son vanished under mysterious circumstances. People say he began seeing things, and something happened to him, something not good. Locals try not to talk about it, but they believe something still lives in that house, and maybe it's still waiting for someone to dare enter." I was creeped out. She didn't give many details, But I felt this wasn't just an ordinary story. I started wondering if I should even keep digging. Part 4. Despite my fear, I decided to return to the house. This time, I was prepared. I contacted the local authorities to learn more about the family who had once lived there. As I suspected, there were no official records of anything strange happening in the house. Just the locals' quiet smiles whenever they mentioned the place. But when I finally returned to 13th Street, something was different. The house looked much older than it did before, even though that shouldn't have been possible. I noticed that the house's surface was now heavily covered in moss and lichen, and its windows, which I had previously thought were sealed shut, were now completely dust-covered. Still, I saw someone inside. I approached the door again. It opened. This time, I wasn't expecting anyone inside, but as soon as I stepped in, I felt the house wake up. The walls began to echo with the same footsteps I had heard last time. With every step, it got darker, and I felt that with each move, something was stretching behind me. And when I approached the same hallway, I suddenly saw him, a man, identical to the one in that photograph. He stood right in front of me and looked at me with dark eyes. "You came," he whispered. Panic took over. I screamed and ran toward the exit, but this time, the door was locked. I lost control and broke the window as I felt someone was right behind me, not letting me go. Since then, I've never returned to that town, and I don't know what happened to the house on 13th Street. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone there, and something still remains in that house, something waiting for the next person who dares to step inside. Since then, I've never sought out old houses again, and never be too sure you can just walk into what seems like an empty place.